The mockery had a specific character that distinguished it from ordinary elevator conversation. It was not the sharp, targeted mockery of a community responding to a single poor decision. It was the recurring, comfortable mockery of a community that had watched a man make the same kind of decision repeatedly across several years, and that had decided the pattern said something definitive about the man making it, something that everyone at the county cooperative and the grain elevator and the equipment dealer service counter could agree on without much discussion, the kind of consensus that forms around a recognizable type. The recognizable type was a man who could not help himself around old iron. The man's name was Harold Fenwick, and he farmed in Hardin County, Ohio, and he had been buying old tractors at estate sales and dispersal auctions and private transactions since 1965, when he acquired his first used machine at a Holmes County estate sale at the age of 28. By 1975, he had purchased 11 used tractors at various venues across north-central Ohio, and the community's observation of these 11 purchases across 10 years had produced the consensus that Harold Fenwick was a man whose weakness for old machines would eventually produce a reckoning with reality that the community was patiently awaiting. The specific observations that produced the consensus were easy to catalogue. Harold's equipment yard at his 200-acre operation east of Kenton showed, to anyone who drove past on the township road, a collection of machines that no modern equipment dealer would have been able to sell on consignment. There were machines from the 1940s and the early 1950s, alongside machines from the mid-1950s and the early 1960s, a range of vintages and manufacturers that communicated, to the community's reading of it, either a collecting impulse that had gotten out of control or a purchasing philosophy that prioritized acquisition price over machine capability, neither of which was the approach that a serious farming operation in Hardin County was supposed to embody. The elevator comments were consistent in their form across the decade. One version noted that Harold Fenwick had been seen at the Putnam County dispersal again, and that the machines he had brought home this time were older than the machines he had brought home last time, which had already been older than the machines the community thought he should have. Another version observed that the Fenwick yard was beginning to resemble a machine museum more than a working farm, and that the machines visible from the road had an average age that exceeded the age of Harold himself. A third version was more direct, that a man who kept buying machines nobody else wanted at prices nobody else would pay was a man who was spending his farm account on a hobby that the farm could not afford. Harold had heard these versions and their variants in the way that all farming community comments travel, through the informal network of the county cooperative and the township road meetings and the specific conversations that happen around the grain scales and the parts counter. He had received them without public response, which itself became part of the community's reading of him, a man who had no defense for his purchasing decisions, which was presumably because the decisions had no defense. He had a defense. He had always had a defense. He chose not to offer it publicly because the defense was in the farm account, and the farm account was not a public document. The defense would become public eventually, in the way that farming community assessments always become public, through the evidence of the operation's outcomes across the years. The outcomes would speak when they were ready to speak. The comment at the elevator would produce its own revision in time. Harold was patient about this. He was patient because he understood with specific numerical clarity what he was doing and why. And the specific numerical clarity was what the community's mockery did not have access to. The mockery had access to the equipment yard visible from the road and the auction purchases that the community's informal network had catalogued, and the pattern those purchases composed when viewed from outside the farm account. The farm account showed something different, and Harold had been building the farm accounts case for 10 years with the specific patience of a man who knows his arithmetic is correct and who is willing to wait for the evidence to confirm what the arithmetic says. The arithmetic had begun in 1964, a year before the first purchase. He had taken over the Fenwick farm from his father in 1963 at the age of 26, inheriting 160 acres of Hardin County cropland that was paid for, and a farm account that showed the modest balance that a 160-acre operation produced in the early 1960s under his father's careful management. His father had explained the account to him in the format that farming fathers explain these things, at the kitchen table, with the notebooks open, the specific purposes of each column addressed in the sequence that made their relationships to each other clear. His father had said, "The equipment fund is the most important column, not because it is the largest. It is rarely the largest, but because the equipment is what makes everything else possible, and the equipment fund is what makes the equipment possible without a note. Every note you take against this farm is a claim on the farm's future income that reduces what the future income can build. The equipment fund prevents the notes by accumulating toward the equipment before the equipment is needed." Harold had maintained the equipment fund column in the format his father had established. What he had added in 1964 was a calculation his father had never done explicitly. An analysis of the cost per productive hour of equipment at different acquisition price points using the service history data that the Hardin County Extension Services Equipment Economics publications provided for common machine models. The calculation showed something that had not been part of the community's received wisdom about used equipment in 1964, but that the numbers made clear when the analysis was done carefully. The relationship between an old tractor's acquisition price and its cost per productive hour was not linear. A machine that was half the price of a newer used machine was not necessarily twice as cheap to operate, but a machine that was well maintained, acquired at a significantly depressed price relative to its actual mechanical condition, and extended by correct service across the years of its use, could produce a cost per productive hour that was substantially lower than the cost per productive hour of a newer machine acquired on note at a higher price. The key variable was the gap between the acquisition price and the mechanical condition. The community's assessment of old tractors priced them primarily by age and appearance. Machines that looked old and worn were priced as old and worn regardless of what the engine and drivetrain actually contained. Harold had recognized from the first estate sale in 1965 that this pricing gap was real and that the skill required to exploit it was mechanical assessment, which was a skill he had been building since he was 12 years old, working on the Fenwick farm equipment alongside his father and his uncle, who had been a diesel mechanic at the International Harvester dealer in Kenton for 30 years. The uncle was the primary teacher, though he had not formally organized the instruction. He had let Harold watch, then helped, then do the work with supervision, then do the work independently, across a decade of Saturday afternoons in the IH dealer's service bay. By the time Harold was 22, he could disassemble and reassemble most of the IH engine families, could read compression and oil analysis as primary diagnostic instruments, and had the tactile knowledge that distinguished bearing sounds that were acceptable from bearing sounds that were one season from failure. He could not do everything a factory-trained mechanic could do. He could do the assessment work that the purchasing decision required, and he could do the service work that the machines required year to year after purchase. This was the foundation that the 1964 cost-per-hour analysis was built on. Without the mechanical assessment capability, the analysis was theoretical. You could calculate that a well-maintained old tractor at a low acquisition price was economical, but you could not act on the calculation because you had no reliable method of distinguishing the well-maintained machine from the worn-out machine at the auction. With the mechanical assessment capability, the analysis became operational. Harold could walk into a dispersal sale and evaluate the machines that were available, identify the ones whose mechanical condition was better than their appearance suggested, determine an acquisition price at which the cost per hour arithmetic worked, and act or not act based on whether the available machines at their expected prices met the standard. He had first acted in October of 1965 at the Holmes County estate sale, where a 1949 Oliver 88 was available among 3 other machines. The estate had been a small operation, and the auction had attracted fewer serious equipment buyers than a larger dispersal would have drawn, because the equipment inventory was not impressive at first glance. 4 machines, all old, all showing the weathering of a farm that had not been in the equipment painting and cosmetic maintenance business. The auction crowd had been appropriately skeptical, and the 1949 Oliver had drawn the kind of pre-auction assessment, men walking around it, looking at the seat and the sheet metal and the general age presentation, that predicted a modest price. Harold had spent 40 minutes with the Oliver before the auction crowd arrived. He had disconnected the ignition and removed the spark plugs and hand-turned the flywheel for the compression check. He had pulled the oil dipstick and looked at the oil on the back of his hand in the light, feeling the viscosity, checking for metal content that would have been visible as a slight sparkle. He had started the engine and listened to it through the warm-up and through the transition from cold to operating temperature, paying attention to the bearing sounds and the valve chatter and the specific quality of the idle that communicated governor condition. He'd cycled the hydraulics and checked the transmission engagement and checked the front axle for play. The Oliver was in the condition that the arithmetic required. The engine was honest, not rebuilt recently, not performing at new machine specification, but wearing evenly and correctly, the compression readings balanced across all cylinders, the oil showing the clean gradations that indicated it was being changed on schedule. The governor was slightly rough, but within adjustment range. The hydraulics were functional. The front axle was solid. He had purchased the 1949 Oliver 88 for $230. He had driven it onto his trailer, driven it back to Hardin County, and performed the maintenance that the machine's condition indicated it needed. An oil and filter change, a governor adjustment, a carburetor cleaning, a thorough inspection of the hydraulic seals. Total additional cost, $61. The Oliver 88 was in working condition on the Fenwick farm for $291 all in. He had run the cost per hour calculation for the first time with actual numbers. At the expected service life remaining, given the engine's condition, and at the maintenance cost rate that the IH dealer's service records suggested for a maintained Oliver 88, the machine's cost per productive hour was significantly lower than the next cheapest alternative he could have bought, a newer used machine at a price that the equipment fund's current balance could have supported without quite as much calculation. He had written the calculation in the farm account notebook beside the Oliver 88 entry, not as justification. The numbers were the justification, and they spoke for themselves, but as the record of the analysis that had produced the decision, so that the decision could be evaluated against the analysis when the machine's actual service history was long enough to compare against the projection. He had also started a new column in the farm account that fall, not the equipment fund, which tracked the accumulation and the acquisition costs, but a fleet cost per hour column that would track, for each machine in the Fenwick fleet, the running total of acquisition cost plus maintenance cost divided by productive hours worked. The column would show year by year whether the cost per hour arithmetic that had justified each purchase was being borne out by the machine's actual service. The first entry in the Oliver 88's cost per hour column was the acquisition and restoration cost, $291, 0 hours worked, cost per hour not yet calculable. By the fall of 1967, After 2 working seasons, the Oliver had logged 432 productive hours at a total cost of $348. The acquisition plus the 2 seasons maintenance. Cost per hour, 80 cents. The comparable cost for a newer used machine of equivalent capability, financed at current rates, was $2.12 per hour, including the note payments. The arithmetic was correct. Not in projection, in actuality, confirmed by 2 seasons of operating experience and the service log that recorded every maintenance item and its cost. Harold had made the second purchase in 1967, the third in 1969, the fourth and fifth in 1970, a Putnam County dispersal where 2 machines were available simultaneously and both met the arithmetic standard, and the 6th through 11th across the following 5 years, each purchase following the same process: assessment, arithmetic, acquisition at the price the arithmetic supported, restoration to working condition at the minimum necessary cost, service log started and maintained without gaps. By 1975, the Fenwick fleet was 11 machines of various vintages, the oldest being the 1949 Oliver 88, now in its 10th working season. The newest being a 1958 International 350, acquired in 1973 at a Wyandotte County estate. The fleet covered 240 acres, the original 160 plus 2 acquisitions that the farm accounts accumulation had made possible, the first in 1969 and the second in 1972. The land fund column that Harold had started when he identified the first expansion target had operated the same way as the equipment fund, accumulating from the income differential that the low-cost fleet produced, building toward the acquisition price without institutional debt, buying when the fund was sufficient. The community's mockery in 1975 was still operating from the 1965 reading. Old iron in the yard, oldest tractors in the county reputation, the museum comment at the cooperative. The community had not revised its interpretation because the information that would have revised it was not visible from the township road. The additional acquisitions of 1969 and 1972 were land purchases, visible as land records, but not particularly dramatic as individual transactions, the kind of careful expansion that the community noted without emphasizing. The fleet cost per hour column was not visible from the road. The farm account accumulation rate that the low-cost fleet produced was not visible from the cooperative. The 2 additional parcels of Hardin County ground that were paid for and productive were not announced. What was visible was the equipment yard. What the equipment yard showed was what the community was reading. The reading was wrong. The reading would not be corrected until 1979, when Harold bought the Metzger ground. The Metzger farm was 94 acres of Hardin County cropland that adjoined the Fenwick operation on the south, and it had been Harold's primary land fund target since 1973, when he had identified the Metzger family's succession situation. The Metzger family had no farming heirs. The 4 children had all left Hardin County for careers in Columbus and Dayton and Toledo, and the parents were in their 70s and farming the ground with the reduced management of people in their 70s who are farming without the help they had had when the children were at home. Harold had started the Metzger column in the farm account in 1973, the balance starting at 0. He had driven to the Metzger farm in the spring of 1973 and had spoken with the elder Metzger about the possibility of a future transaction. He had said, directly and without the circling that such conversations sometimes required, that if the family was ever thinking about the next chapter for the farm, he would want the first conversation. Metzger had said he appreciated Harold's directness and that the family had been talking about it. He had said he would keep Harold in mind when the talking became deciding. Harold had farmed for 6 years with the Metzger column building. The fleet's low operating cost had been producing the accumulation rate that the 1964 arithmetic had projected. The differential between what the 11-machine fleet cost per year in maintenance and what a comparable financed new fleet would have cost per year in note payments was flowing to the land fund at a rate that made the Metzger acquisition timeline specific rather than indefinite. The Metzger transaction had happened in the fall of 1979. 6 years after the first conversation, the Metzger column having built to the price that the senior Metzger's estate attorney had communicated as the family's number. Harold had arrived at the closing with the farm account balance that made the transaction a cash purchase with no institutional involvement. 94 additional acres of Hardin County ground paid for at the closing, no note. 334 acres. The original 160, the 1969 edition, the 1972 edition, the Metzger ground, all paid for. The fleet cost per hour column in the farm account had funded the land fund column, and the land fund column had funded the acquisitions. The cooperative had heard about the Metzger closing in the way that significant land transactions traveled in Hardin County, through the title search and the county records, and the informal network that carried such information from one end of the farming community to the other. The reaction at the cooperative had been a mild version of the revision that always followed a transaction of this kind, a recognition that the Fenwick operation had added 94 acres in cash, which was a transaction that commanded a certain respect, regardless of what the equipment yard looked like. But the mockery had not yet fully converted to respect, because the equipment yard still looked the same, and the community's interpretation of the equipment yard had not been fully updated by the Metzger transaction. A man could make a good land decision and still have a problematic relationship with old iron. The community was not wrong about what it saw in the yard. It was wrong about what the yard meant. The meaning of the yard became visible in 1983 when Harold did something that converted the mockery entirely. He held an equipment demonstration. He invited the members of the County Agricultural Cooperative and the Extension Service's farm management audience to the Fenwick farm on a Saturday in September of 1983, and he showed them the fleet cost per hour column in the farm account. Not the whole account, the column. He had prepared a chart, hand-lettered on a large paper that he had taped to the barn wall, that showed, for each of the 11 machines in the fleet, the acquisition cost, the total maintenance cost to date, the productive hours logged, and the resulting cost per productive hour. He had also prepared a comparison column showing what the equivalent productive capacity in financed new or newer used equipment would have cost per hour at the lending rates of the relevant years. The chart showed, in numbers that were not projected or estimated but drawn directly from the farm account service log-supported records, that the Fenwick fleet's average cost per productive hour across the 18 years of operation was 67 cents. The comparable cost for the equipment finance alternative was $2.18. The differential, across 18 years and the actual productive hours the fleet had logged on Hardin County ground, was a number that several of the cooperative members present did the arithmetic on and then did again to confirm. The number that resulted from multiplying the per-hour differential by the productive hours worked across 18 years was the number that had funded the land acquisitions. It was approximately equal in round terms to the combined purchase price of the 3 parcels Harold had added to the Fenwick operation since 1965. The fleet had paid for the land. The old tractors that the community had mocked had paid for the land. The cooperative members stood in front of the barn wall chart and were quiet in the specific way of people who have just had a number change the meaning of what they have been observing. The number did not change the observations. The equipment yard still held 11 old machines, and everything the community had said about the machines over 18 years was accurate as a description of what was visible. What the number changed was the interpretation of what the visible evidence meant. It did not mean a man with a weakness for old iron. It meant a man with a cost-per-hour analysis that had been running for 18 years and that had funded 3 land acquisitions, that 334 acres of paid-for Hardin County cropland now represented. A man named Gerhardt, who had been at the cooperative when the first Oliver 88 purchase had been noted and who had been among the more consistent contributors to the mockery across the years, had stood in front of the chart for a longer time than most. He had asked Harold 3 questions about how the productive hour count was determined, about whether the maintenance cost figures were complete or whether some costs were excluded, and about what the methodology was for assessing the mechanical condition at the time of purchase that had justified each acquisition price. Harold had answered all 3 questions specifically and completely. The productive hour count came from the service log's seasonal entry system, in which each machine's hours were recorded at the beginning and end of each working season. The maintenance cost figures were complete, every part and service expense attributed to each machine individually in the fleet cost column. The mechanical assessment methodology was the systematic process he had developed from his uncle's training and his own experience, applied consistently at every acquisition. Gerhardt had said, "You have been doing this since '65. Harold had said, "Since '64, when I did the first calculation. Since '65, when I made the first purchase." Gerhardt had said, "And you never explained it." Harold had said, "The chart explains it. I was waiting until the chart had enough years in it to be meaningful." Gerhardt had looked at the chart for another moment. He had said, 18 years is enough years. Harold had said, "I thought so." Gerhardt had been among the most thoughtful converters, not just to a revised opinion of Harold's equipment decisions, but to a genuine engagement with the methodology itself. He had driven home from the Fenwick farm demonstration and had looked at his own farm account with a framework he had not had that morning. His own fleet was newer than Harold's, more expensive per machine, more financed, more consistent with the community norm. His cost per productive hour was higher than Harold's. He did not have to calculate this to know it was true. The chart had made the relationship clear enough that the directional conclusion was obvious without the specific arithmetic. He had not converted his fleet immediately. Fleet conversion was not how the lesson applied. You did not sell your current equipment and buy old machines and expect to reproduce the Fenwick result, because the Fenwick result depended on the assessment capability that Harold had built over 30 years of engine work and that Gerhardt did not have and could not quickly acquire. What he could apply was the cost-per-hour framework to his next equipment decision, evaluating the options not by age or appearance, but by the total cost of ownership over the expected service period, and choosing the option that the arithmetic supported rather than the option that the community norm recommended. His next equipment decision, made in 1984, was different from the decisions he had made in the previous decade. He spent more time on the assessment. He ran the cost-per-hour projection. He chose a machine that was older than his previous purchase pattern and that was priced accordingly, and he performed a more complete pre-purchase assessment than he had previously done. The machine's actual service record confirmed the projection over the following 5 years. He had mentioned this to Harold at the cooperative in 1989 without making a major statement of it, just the observation that the 1984 decision had worked out the way the arithmetic said it would. Harold had said, "The arithmetic is reliable when the assessment is correct." Gerhardt had said, "That is the part I am still working on." Harold had said, "You work on it by doing it. There is no faster method." The Fenwick fleet continued growing across the 1980s. 2 additional machines acquired in 1981 and 1984. Both older models at prices that the assessment had confirmed were below their mechanical value, both performing across their service years at the cost-per-hour rate that the fleet column continued recording. By 1990, the fleet was 13 machines, the oldest now in its 41st year and still working the Hardin County ground at the rate its maintenance history supported, the newest being the 1984 acquisition in its 6th working season. The 1949 Oliver 88 was still running, 41 years old. The third rebuild since Harold bought it had been done in 1987. The second comprehensive overhaul of the engine, the connecting rod bearings replaced, the valve guides replaced, the carburetor rebuilt for the third time. The governor adjusted to the specification that 40 years of operation had shifted slightly from. The rebuild cost had been $840 at the IH dealer's shop, done over 2 weeks in the winter of 1987. Harold had brought the engine in on a Monday and had described the condition to the service manager and had said what the rebuild needed to accomplish. The service manager, who had known Harold and his assessment capability since the 1970s, had said he would inspect and confirm Harold's list before adding anything. The service manager's inspection had added nothing to Harold's list. Everything Harold had described was what the engine needed. The service manager had noted this to Harold afterward, not as praise exactly, but as the professional confirmation of one capable person by another. The Oliver 88's cost per hour entry in the farm account for 1987, including the rebuild cost allocated over the expected remaining service years, had remained the lowest per hour cost in the fleet. The oldest machine was still the most economical machine per productive hour worked. Not because it had the lowest maintenance cost, the rebuild had been expensive, but because the acquisition cost of $230 in 1965 was spread across 41 years of productive service, and the denominator of that equation, the accumulated productive hours, was large enough that even the rebuild cost barely moved the per-hour average. Harold had shown this calculation to his son Daniel in the fall of 1987, when Daniel was 19 and beginning the transition into active farm management. Daniel had looked at the Oliver 88's column and had said, "The machine has paid for itself several times over." Harold had said, "The machine has paid for acres." The machine's column includes a contribution figure, the share of the land fund accumulation that came from this machine's per-hour cost differential versus the financed new alternative. That figure, for the Oliver 88 alone, represents a portion of the Metzger ground. Daniel had said the Oliver 88 paid for part of the Metzger acres. Harold had said the fleet cost per hour discipline paid for the Metzger acres. The Oliver 88 is the oldest and the most visible example of that discipline, but every machine in the fleet contributed to the same account. The discipline was collective. The contribution was distributed. Daniel had looked at the 13 machines in the equipment yard, the same yard that had been the subject of Hardin County mockery since the mid-1960s, and had understood them for the first time as what they were, rather than what they appeared to be. They appeared to be old iron. They were a cost-per-hour system that had funded 334 acres of paid-for Hardin County cropland. The appearance had not changed. The understanding had. Daniel would manage the Fenwick operation from the early 1990s, maintaining the fleet cost-per-hour discipline and the farm account in the format Harold had established. He would not replicate Harold's specific fleet composition. The machines Harold had found and the prices Harold had paid at the dispersal sales of the 1960s and 1970s were specific to that era's equipment market, and the same market dynamics did not exist in the 1990s and 2000s in the same form. But the discipline translated, the systematic assessment, the cost-per-hour calculation before the acquisition, the service log maintained without gaps, the fleet cost column updated every season. The 1949 Oliver 88 was retired in 1993, when the engine had reached the point where the cost of the next rebuild, allocated over the projected remaining service years, no longer produced a cost per hour that met the standard. Harold had made the retirement decision with Daniel present and had shown him the calculation. The rebuild cost, the projected remaining hours, the resulting per-hour cost if the rebuild were done, compared against the per-hour cost of the replacement machine that had already been identified at a dispersal sale in Logan County. The numbers said, retire the Oliver and acquire the Logan County machine. Harold had said, when the numbers say it is time, you listen to the numbers. Daniel had said, even the oldest machine. Harold had said, especially the oldest machine. The discipline is not about keeping old machines. The discipline is about the cost per hour standard. When the standard says a machine has given what it has to give, you honor the machine's service and you acquire the next one that the standard supports. The Oliver had been sold to a collector in Wayne County who specialized in running restorations of mid-century farm equipment and who paid $450 for a machine that had been acquired for $230 in 1965. A net acquisition cost after subtracting the residual value of negative $220. The machine had paid back more than it had cost in residual value alone before accounting for the 28 years of cost per hour differential that the farm account column recorded. Harold had made the final entry in the Oliver 88 service log the morning the collector arrived. The entry read, retired after 28 working seasons on Hardin County ground, engine rebuilt 3 times, cost per productive hour across full service period, 62 cents. Contribution to Land Fund column. See acquisition records for the 1972 and Metzger parcels. He closed the log. He handed it to the collector along with the machine. The collector had asked why the log. Harold had said, the log is the machine's history. The machine should not travel without its history. The collector had taken the log and the machine. Harold had stood in the equipment yard and had watched them go. The equipment yard had 12 machines remaining. 11 of them were older than most equipment dealers would have considered for consignment. All of them had cost per hour columns in the farm account. All of them had service logs maintained without gaps. 334 acres, all paid for. The mockery had ended in 1983 at the barn wall chart. The discipline that had been mocked had not ended. The discipline had never ended. It continued. The numbers continued. The land continued. The farm continued. That was the account. That was the whole of it. The oldest tractors had done it. The cost per hour had said so. For 28 years, without exception, without interruption, that was sufficient. The barn wall chart demonstration in September of 1983 had ripple effects in the Hardin County farming community that spread in the way that genuinely new information spreads in a community whose prior understanding of something was incomplete, not immediately and not uniformly, but persistently through the specific conversations that the new information prompted between people who had attended the demonstration and people who had not, and through the subsequent revisiting of past observations in the light of the corrected understanding. 3 of the men who had attended the demonstration had gone home and looked at their own farm accounts with the cost per hour framework for the first time. None of them had a fleet cost per hour column. Harold's column was the specific invention of the 1964 analysis, not a standard farm account feature in Hardin County or anywhere else in north-central Ohio that any of the 3 had encountered. But the concept was simple enough to apply without a column if you had the relevant numbers available, and 2 of the 3 had sufficient account detail to do the back calculation on their primary tractor's operating cost. The back calculations produced results that were instructive in the same direction as Harold's chart, though at a less dramatic scale. The community's newer equipment had not been acquired with the same price efficiency that Harold's assembly process had found, but neither had it been acquired at the most expensive end of the financing spectrum. The results showed that the cost per hour framework was a useful lens regardless of the specific fleet composition, and that applying it prospectively to the next equipment decision was the minimal version of what Harold had been doing systematically since 1964. A woman named Koila, who farmed with her husband in the western part of the county and who had attended the demonstration as a member of the Extension Service's farm management program rather than as a cooperative member specifically, had been the most systematic in applying the framework after the September session. She had spent the following week constructing the cost per hour column retrospectively for her operations primary tractor, using the service log and the purchase records and the account books for the relevant years. The calculation had shown her cost per hour as substantially higher than Harold's fleet average, but lower than the most expensive alternative she had considered at the time of the most recent acquisition. More useful than the retrospective calculation had been the prospective framework she had built from Harold's demonstration, a decision template for the next equipment acquisition that included a pre-purchase assessment checklist, a cost-per-hour projection, and a comparison against the alternatives available at the time. She had brought this template to the County Extension Service's farm management advisor and had asked whether it was consistent with the approaches the Extension Service recommended. The Extension advisor, a man who had been working with Hardin County farm operations for 11 years and who had attended the Fenwick demonstration at Harold's invitation, had said it was consistent in concept with the best practices literature, though in practice most operations did not apply it as systematically as the Fenwick operation had. He had said he was considering whether the Fenwick methodology should be presented at the Extension Service's Winter Farm Management Series as a case study. He had presented it in January of 1984. Harold had attended the Winter Series session in which his methodology was presented, not as the presenter. He had given the barn wall demonstration and had said what needed to be said there, but as an audience member who was available for questions. The Winter Series audience had been larger than the September demonstration's attendance because the Extension Winter Series drew the broader farming community that the cooperative demonstration had not reached. The questions from the Winter Series audience had been more varied than the cooperative audience's questions because the range of operation types and scales was broader. Some questions were about the assessment methodology, how to develop the diagnostic capability that the purchasing process required. Some were about the fleet management logistics of operating machines that required parts that were sometimes difficult to source from standard dealer channels. Some were about the service log format and what it needed to contain to support the cost per hour calculation. Some were about how the approach interacted with the farm account structure, specifically how the fleet cost column related to the equipment fund column. Harold had answered all of them. He had been speaking about this material for one semester. The September demonstration had been the first time he had explained it publicly, and the Winter Series was the second time. And the second telling produced a clarity and completeness that the first had not fully achieved. He had developed, in the 4 months between the September demonstration and the January session, a more organized presentation of the methodology than the barn wall chart had provided, a presentation that addressed the questions he had received in September and that anticipated the questions the broader audience would likely ask. He had also brought a second document to the January session that he had not brought to the September demonstration, a summary table that showed not just the fleet cost per hour comparison, but the accumulated land fund contribution from the fleet cost differential across the 19 years since the 1964 analysis had been started. The table showed year by year what the fleet had cost, what the financed new alternative would have cost, and what the difference had produced in the land fund that had funded the 3 parcel acquisitions. The table was the complete account of what the mockery had missed. The accumulated differential across 19 years, compounded by the income contribution of each acquired parcel that the differential had purchased, was a number that several members of the Winter Series audience wrote down and kept. One of them, a young farmer named Steele, who was in his first year managing his family's operation in eastern Hardin County, and who had no context for the Fenwick mockery because he had been too young to have participated in it, had said, after looking at the table, "This is a system." Harold had said yes. Steele had said, "It works because the assessment is reliable." Harold had said, "It works because the assessment is reliable and because the cost per hour standard is maintained without exceptions. Either part alone is insufficient. The assessment without the standard would produce machines that are mechanically sound, but not necessarily economical. The standard without the assessment would produce purchases that appear to meet the arithmetic, but that contain mechanical surprises that the arithmetic did not account for." Steele had said, "You learn the assessment by doing assessments." Harold had said, "And by working on the machines after you own them. The maintenance work teaches you what the assessment should look for. You see a failure mode in a machine you own, and you learn to look for the precursor of that failure mode in the next machine you assess. The fleet is the laboratory." Steele had said, "The fleet is always teaching." Harold had said, "If you are paying attention." Steele had become the most serious subsequent practitioner of the Fenwick methodology among the Hardin County farming community in the years that followed. He had not been in a position to replicate the specific fleet composition that Harold had assembled across 20 years of specific market conditions, but he had applied the framework to his own equipment decisions with a consistency that produced, over the subsequent decade, a cost-per-hour average that was substantially lower than the county norm, and a farm account accumulation rate that had surprised him when he had tabulated it at the 10-year mark. He had driven to the Fenwick farm in 1994 and had shown Harold the 10-year summary he had prepared. The summary showed his fleet's cost-per-hour performance and the resulting land fund contribution, and the land fund had purchased a parcel in 1991 and had the balance to reach for a second parcel that Steele had identified on his eastern boundary. Harold had looked at the summary and had said, "The assessment is reliable." Steele had said, "I am still working on it." Harold had said, "You will always be working on it. That is the correct state." The exchange was brief and at a kitchen table and had no audience. But it was the continuation of the transmission that had begun in the equipment barn when Harold's uncle had let a 12-year-old boy watch the disassembly of an IH engine and had been willing to explain what each component said about the machine's history and condition. The transmission had moved from the uncle to Harold, from Harold to the September demonstration audience, from Harold to the January Winter Series audience, from Harold and the methodology to Steele at the kitchen table, from Steele to the equipment decisions he made, and the service logs he maintained, and the cost-per-hour columns he built in his own farm account. The mockery was part of the transmission's history, in the sense that the mockery had created the occasion for the September demonstration. Harold had not held the demonstration because he needed validation or because he was responding to the mockery's accumulated pressure. He had held it because the fleet had 18 years in it by 1983, which was enough years for the cost-per-hour column to be meaningful rather than merely projective, and because the barn wall chart was the most efficient way to show what 18 years of data looked like when assembled in the format that the data's meaning required. He had been waiting for 18 years, not with impatience, but with the specific patience of a man who has done the arithmetic and knows the arithmetic is correct, and who understands that the arithmetic's confirmation requires the years to pass. 18 years of Hardin County seasons, 11 machines acquired and maintained and logged and calculated, 3 parcels purchased and paid for. The mockery had been running concurrent with the arithmetic for 18 years. The arithmetic had been correct for 18 years. The mockery had been based on incomplete information for 18 years. The barn wall chart was not a response to the mockery. It was the arithmetic made visible for the first time. The mockery's revision had been a consequence of the visibility, not the purpose of it. Harold had kept the original barn wall chart after the September demonstration. The large paper that he had taped to the barn wall, hand-lettered with the fleet data that had been the mockery's correction. He had put it in the farm office filing cabinet alongside the farm account notebooks and the fleet cost column summaries and the service logs for each of the 13 machines currently in the fleet. The chart was not a trophy, it was a document. The same kind of document as the service logs and the account notebooks, a record of the analysis that had produced the decisions, maintained in the format that made the analysis legible and the decisions evaluable. The documents in the filing cabinet were the complete record of what the Fenwick farm had been doing since 1964. They were the answer to the mockery's question, what was the man doing with all those old tractors? An answer that the mockery had never bothered to ask, because the mockery's reading of the visible evidence had seemed sufficient. The visible evidence had not been sufficient. The documents were the sufficiency. Harold retired from active management in 1995, at 58, handing the operation to Daniel in the formal way of a man who has prepared the handover for years and who knows the preparation is complete because the person receiving it has been executing the methodology independently for long enough to confirm that the execution is sound. He had looked at the equipment yard on the day of the formal handover. 13 machines, the youngest in its 11th working season, the oldest in its 19th. The yard looked as it had always looked, old iron in rows, the weathering of working machines that were maintained for performance rather than appearance. The township road that ran past the yard carried in 1995 the same view it had carried in 1965 and 1975 and 1985. The view had not changed. What had changed was that nobody in Hardin County called it a museum anymore. The mockery had ended. The discipline had not. The discipline continued. The farm continued. The cost per hour continued. The oldest tractors were still working, and the people who had mocked the farmer who bought them were, some of them, keeping their own fleet cost columns now. That was the whole account. That was what the old tractors had done with themselves. That was sufficient. The specific sourcing process that had built the Fenwick fleet across 20 years was itself a methodology. Not improvised purchase by purchase, but a structured approach to identifying and evaluating acquisition opportunities before they occurred, so that when the opportunity presented itself, Harold was already positioned to assess it and act or decline based on the arithmetic rather than reacting to the moment's urgency. The process had three components that Harold had refined by the early 1970s into a consistent practice. The first was what he called the opportunity calendar, a record maintained in a notebook separate from the farm account of every farming operation in the relevant 5-county area whose succession situation suggested a dispersal event within the next 5 years. He had built this calendar from the informal knowledge of the farming community network, the ages of the primary operators, the presence or absence of farming heirs, the scale and equipment composition of the operation. Information that was generally available in a farming community to anyone who was paying the kind of attention that Harold was paying. The opportunity calendar in 1975 listed 23 operations whose equipment dispersal was likely within the 5-year horizon, with Harold's estimate of the machine types and vintage ranges likely to be available at each dispersal based on what he knew about each operation's fleet. Against each operation, he had noted whether the machine types aligned with the Fenwick fleet's specific needs at that point, which machines in the fleet were approaching the cost per hour threshold at which retirement and replacement would be economical, and which vintage and manufacturer combinations had historically provided the cost per hour performance his standard required. The calendar had a second section, a record of the dispersal events that had occurred in the previous 3 years, with a post-acquisition assessment of how the event had matched the pre-event prediction. Had the machines Harold anticipated been available? Had the prices been in the range he had projected? Had the mechanical condition been consistent with what the opportunity calendar's operation profile had suggested? The comparison between the pre-event prediction and the post-event reality was the calibration mechanism for the prediction process. It showed Harold where his predictions were systematically off and gave him the information to adjust. By the mid-1970s, the calibration had been running long enough that Harold's pre-dispersal predictions were accurate enough to be operationally useful. He could tell with reasonable confidence whether a specific dispersal event in the 5-county area was worth the time and expense of attendance, the overnight stay, if the event was far enough, the day away from the farm during the planting or harvest season, based on whether the pre-event profile suggested the kind of opportunity the fleet cost per hour standard could use. He had attended 41 dispersal events between 1965 and 1983. He had made purchases at 19 of them. The 22 attended events at which he had not made purchases were not wasted attendances. They were the calibration events that kept his assessment accurate and his price expectations current. And they were also the occasions for the specific learning that only the physical examination of machines provided. Every machine he assessed and did not buy had taught him something about the specific failure modes and wear patterns and maintenance histories that the machines in his fleet categories produced across their service lives. The non-purchase assessments were the continuing education component of the methodology. If Harold had bought every machine he assessed, the assessment skill would have been applied but not refined by the failure mode learning that came from finding machines that did not meet the standard and understanding precisely why they did not meet it. The machines he declined to buy were as important to the methodology as the machines he bought, because the declining was based on a specific finding. The third cylinder with uneven wear, the governor that had been adjusted outside specification to mask a carburetor problem, the hydraulic system with a seal pattern that indicated more comprehensive work than the acquisition price accounted for, and each specific finding was added to the mental library of things to look for in the next assessment. His uncle had told him early in the service bay years, "You learn more from the engine that is failing than from the engine that is running correctly. The running engine confirms what you know. The failing engine teaches you something new." Harold had carried this to the assessment methodology. The machines he declined to buy were the failing engines, the ones that told him something new about what failure looked like in the specific machine categories he was working with. The machines he bought were the running engines, the ones that confirmed the assessment was accurate and that produced the cost per hour performance the arithmetic had projected. The second component of the process was the fleet retirement schedule, the forward-looking projection of which machines in the current fleet were approaching the cost per hour threshold, with Harold's estimate of the year at which the retirement decision would become appropriate for each machine. The schedule was not deterministic. The actual retirement year depended on the machine's maintenance trajectory and on the availability of a suitable replacement, but it gave Harold a 2 to 3 year advance notice of which fleet positions were going to become open, which shaped how he read the opportunity calendar. If the fleet retirement schedule showed that a machine in the primary tillage category would likely reach the retirement threshold in 2 years, then a dispersal event featuring primary tillage machines of the right vintage and manufacturer had a specific relevance that the same event would not have if all the fleet positions in that category were stable. The interaction between the retirement schedule and the opportunity calendar was what allowed Harold to be specific about which attended events were worth attending and which ones were not. Not because the other events had no good machines, but because the good machines at those events did not fill a fleet need that the retirement schedule identified. He had explained this to Daniel in the context of the fleet transition they had been managing together since the late 1980s. The gradual shift from the specific machine composition Harold had built in the 1960s and 1970s to the composition that a 1990s Hardin County operation at 334 acres required, adjusted for the equipment market of the 1990s, which was different from the equipment market of the 1960s, in specific ways that the methodology accommodated without abandoning its core structure. Daniel had asked, "The market is different now. The dispersal events that produced the fleet in the 60s and 70s are not the same dispersal events available now." Harold had said, "The market has different machine vintages available in it, and the price dynamics are different because the collector market for old farm equipment has developed and has put upward pressure on the acquisition prices for the oldest and most aesthetically interesting machines. But the fundamental dynamic, the gap between a machine's appearance-based price and its actual mechanical condition, persists in every equipment market at every time, because the appearance-based assessment is always the community's default, and the mechanical condition assessment always requires more capability than the appearance-based assessment." He had said, "The specific machines that represent the best opportunity change with the market." In the 60s and 70s, it was machines from the 40s and 50s. In the 90s, it is machines from the 60s and 70s. The collector market pressure has absorbed the oldest machine's price advantage, but the analysis still applies to the generation of machines that is old enough to trade at appearance-based discounts and young enough that parts remain available and the mechanical architecture is still familiar to people who know it. Daniel had said, "The analysis always applies. The specific application changes." Harold had said, "The analysis always applies. You recalibrate the opportunity calendar to the current market. You adjust the assessment criteria to the machines that are now in the relevant vintage range. The framework is constant. The data it operates on changes." Daniel had been applying the framework to the 1990s market since the late 1980s, with results that were tracking the cost per hour standard despite the different market conditions. The specific machines were different. The methodology was the same. The third component of the process was the maintenance system, not just the service logs, which were the record, but the maintenance planning that the service logs informed. Harold had, since the early 1970s, maintained a fleet maintenance calendar that projected the scheduled service requirements for all fleet machines across the coming year, based on the service log's historical interval data and the current season's projected hours. The calendar showed, at any point in the year, which machines had service coming due in the next 30, 60, and 90 days, allowing the maintenance to be scheduled in advance, rather than addressed reactively. Reactive maintenance was the failure mode that the Fenwick approach was specifically designed to avoid. Reactive maintenance meant service was performed when the machine told you it was needed, through a failure or a symptom, rather than before the failure had the opportunity to develop. Preventive maintenance, scheduled from the service log's interval data, meant service was performed before the symptom appeared, at the interval the machine's history showed was consistent with the symptom's absence. The fleet maintenance calendar was the instrument that made preventive maintenance possible at fleet scale. With a single machine, the intervals were simple enough to track without a calendar. With 13 machines, the interval tracking required a system, a way of seeing in a single view what was coming due and when, so that the preparation of parts and the scheduling of the shop time could be done in advance rather than in response. The old tractors were still working. They had always been working. The mockery had read the yard. The arithmetic had read the account. The account showed 334 acres. That was the answer. That was sufficient.